Good morning. We'll wait a few minutes for everybody else to sign on.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everyone. How you doing?
Morning, Ryan. Okay, while other people are signing on, a couple quick announcements. There are a few of you who still haven't told me what group you want to be in. So get that to me by like 5 today if possible, noon today if really possible. Otherwise, I'm just gonna like put the rest of you in a group and be like, pick a topic. The other groups are pretty much set. So as soon as I get that information from the other people, I will get that to y'all. Or maybe after this, if I have a chance, I will post just the groups that are set. So please shoot me an email back. You should have an email from me from Thursday or Friday about that. The other thing is after this class at 11, so there's a 15-minute break in between, we will be having a remembrance reflection time for Colin Wolfe, who's the student who died by suicide. So no one is required to come, but if you knew him or just want to sit with people who are also sort of learning how to cope with this, you are more than welcome. All 4 psychology professors will be there. And we just want to give you all space to reflect, ask questions, grieve, or celebrate Colin's life. So that is on Zoom. Dr. Jackson sent you an email with the Zoom info for that in there, but just in case, I can throw it in the chat as well because I'm the one who set it up. So because I'm the one in the department who has the fancy Zoom account since I'm teaching all remotely. So let me open up the chat here. So that's at 11 today. Let me see if there's anything else we need to be thinking about. Next exam is coming up. I'm blanking on the date, so let me open the syllabus really quickly for y'all. Oh, you know what? I printed it out for myself so I don't have to open it every time. So next exam is the 18th. So a week from Thursday, the 18th. And it will cover depression, treatments for depression, suicide, and anxiety and stress disorders. So those chapters. It'll be the exact same format as last time, just the short answer, instead of referring to the videos, we'll refer to the clinical choices. So before you get to the exam, do make sure that you are doing those clinical choices activities. Not only will it help you on the exam, but they will probably just help you conceptualize everything better. That's the goal, at least. So, all right. Any questions about anything, logistics or anything? Okie dokie. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get our lecture set up. So we are finishing the lecture on suicide today. And again, thank you all for your patience with me and your sincerity and your sympathy that you've been expressing as I struggle to talk about this topic when it's so fresh in our minds. So just thank you all again. So we will finish this lecture and then we will go on and start the anxiety lecture. So let me get all set up here. Get my chair out of our way here. All right. So let me get the chat in case people want to ask questions there. There. Okay, now everything should be good to go. So here are some of the common predictors of suicide. And again, no suicide is going to have all of these, and no suicide they'll necessarily even have any of these, which sounds strange, but it's true. If someone is like really good at hiding things, you know, you might have no idea. But as we talked about on Thursday, certain mental disorders are more prone to this than others. Depression is one, but you certainly don't have to be depressed to die by suicide. Alcoholism and substance abuse. Certainly the biggest indicator is if the person is talking about suicide. If they're expressing that they have thoughts about suicide. Again, as clinicians, we don't ever not take that seriously. That's a double negative, sorry, but we always take that seriously. So we would immediately try to do what we call contracting for safety. So if the person said, well, I'm thinking about ending my life, you would try to set up a contract for safety, which is, you know, can that person sign a contract saying between now and our next session, I can do these things instead of taking my own life. Or if they can't, then we can involuntarily hospitalize someone. Depending on the state, that will be varying lengths. I think Virginia's 72 hours, which isn't a lot of time, but is usually enough time to get someone started on medication if they're not on it and stabilized. Again, as we talked about last time, certain religious ideas, so cult ideas in particular, of you know, escaping to another plane by suicide or some such, obviously big red flags as well. In psychology, one of the things we say is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and obviously that's not always true, but certainly something we want to look into. So if they have prior attempts, we should sort of keep an eye on that. If they're talking about or using very lethal methods, again, shooting yourself, stepping in front of a train, things along those lines. If they're living alone, they're in isolation, they're experiencing loss of support. Again, this is why COVID is so difficult. It's also why coming back from deployment can be really difficult for our servicemen and women, because service people, that's gender all-inclusive. Okay, service people, because they feel like no one around them understands what they went through. If anyone's ever seen the movie The Hurt Locker, at the end of it, Jeremy Renner's character is just standing in the aisle, the cereal aisle of his local grocery store, and just is overwhelmed, right? And no one else around him would understand that feeling, right? Hopelessness, again, only is that four-letter word. Cognitive rigidity of thinking this is the only thing I can do. People who are impulsive and risk-taking. So again, these might be more those death darers, right? Who would play Russian roulette or things along those lines. Being an older white male is actually one of the highest risks for suicide. And that is because, not for everyone, but for some people who have been in positions of power their whole life, been in positions of privilege. When you retire and you don't have that esteem anymore, it can be really eye-opening and difficult. So, you know, feelings of isolation, feelings of loss of virility, vitality. Modeling. So this is a big part of, I'm just going to be super honest with you. This is a big part of why I'm a little ticked off at the administration right now. Wow, that's a really nice way to say it. Because the day after Colin's death by suicide, I reached out to both President Miller and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Maynard Chauss, and I said, look, I've survived a suicide before. I also know sort of what should be done here. One of the biggest things that can happen is that suicide can end up being contagious because people think, well, that seemed to work for that person, so I should do it too. And so I said, we need to name it. We need to not shy away from it. We need to talk about it. And they offered to have me come in person, which y'all know I can't come to campus yet. I'm only half vaccinated, to the thing they had the day after Colin's death. And that was it. They haven't like touched base with me at all. And no one's talking about it. No one's acknowledging it. And so, yeah, I'm a little ticked off. Just say that's probably the understatement of the century, because they've been handling it exactly the wrong way. And I found out from Dr. Clayton in social work on Friday that apparently there have been other people who have made attempts since then, which is exactly what I was talking about. So to you all, I would say, please name it on campus. Talk about it for what it was. It was a death by suicide. We didn't just lose a Marlin. It was a death by suicide. It's really important to name it and also to show the fallout from it. I don't know how many of you all were able to or felt inclined to log on to the memorial service last week, but seeing his parents is what really got to me. Like, his mom just put her hand on the coffin and said, "What the F," you know? Yeah, okay, so someone said in the comments they have a history of not handling things well, like when they asked for the sexual history of a rape victim that sued them. Yes, I'm very familiar with that case. This is a little like sidestep, but give me 2 seconds to talk about this because I knew her. Her name is out there. I don't feel the need to name her, but you can find it if you want. She was my advisee. She was going to be a psych WGS double major, which, like, everyone knows that's my jam, right? And she was sexually assaulted during orientation. And she was this friend who did everything right. She walked all her other friends home, and then she was the last one. And this guy took advantage of that. And so in that case, and this sounds absolutely atrocious, in that case, based on the case her lawyer made, they had to do that because her lawyer was arguing she had never had sex since then. So it's like if someone said, I got whiplash from a car accident, you have to like have medical files to show that, right? So this, not that the school handled it the best way possible, right? But her lawyer is the one that truly screwed her over. Her lawyer was an ambulance chaser from Richmond. He'd never done a sexual assault case before. And so he like kept, like the judge had a gag order and the lawyer kept breaking it and kept getting admonished. Anyway, yes, but they don't always handle things well. At that time, some of the faculty and students did organize a large meeting and talk about what was going on. And that was good, but that was all that happened. Kind of like they had the one event at the lighthouse and then we're not going to talk about it anymore. Yeah, optics are really important to, I think, any sort of company or institution. But I think there's a time when we need to put optics aside and take care of our own. And so that's what I've been trying to do for you all. But again, I'm only one person, so that's kind of hard, especially when I can't be there in person. So yes, we should definitely be naming it. So to prevent modeling. If you've had suicides in the family, you know, there may be a genetic component, we're not sure. So some of you have probably heard in your psych classes of the famous case of there were a set of twins and one of them, their circumcision was botched at birth. And so they decided to try to raise that male female. And, you know, based on all the knowledge we have now about trans individuals, right, we know that that doesn't work. You can't just force someone to be a different gender than what they experience, right? And so that person committed suicide. And so everyone's always sort of like, wow, it was because of this experiment. And certainly it largely was, but the twin also committed suicide. So again, there's some genetic component to that too. And I think that helps us remember that everything's always more complicated than we want to say it is, right? I think that's a really important piece of this to remember. Economic or work problems. Oh, wow, Charleston. I'm so sorry that you haven't even told the RAs about other things. Yeah, and again, this is like, I hear things like 27th hand most of the time, but I trust Dr. Clayton just because she has no reason to manufacture that, and her students trust her, right? She's not only someone with a social work degree, but she's also, one of our few faculty of color. So students feel an affinity with her. So, but yeah, that's really too bad, Charleston. If you're having work problems, certain occupations, as we talked about last week, like dentists, have higher rates. Marital problems and kind of family pathology. Our minister who committed suicide was going through a really messy divorce, and she died by suicide. Sorry, again, I'm training myself to use the right language, y'all. And so that was the cause. It wasn't anything that the church did. Stress and stressful events. Are we in a lot of stressful events right now? Yes, right? Anger, aggression, irritability, psychosis, physical illness, and then again, like combinations of these things. The other thing that's not on this list that really should be is minority status. So for example, we know that rates are really high among LGBTQ plus individuals. And that's why things like the Trevor Project exists. We know that certain other minorities, again, are more likely to see suicide as a solution. So a little bit more about modeling. So suicides that are bizarre or unusual, that are carried out by celebrities or that are highly publicized, or when you're in a small institution like my church or Wesleyan, right? Everyone knows, and if you don't know that person, you know someone who knows that person, right? In celebrity cases, we see this tied to intense coverage by the media. So, for example, Kurt Cobain's suicide, we saw copycat suicides after that. So this is always something we try to be aware of. And even media programs that are intended to educate and help viewers may either spur imitations or give people idea. So this is obviously not the same thing, but I had a friend in college who had never had an eating disorder until she watched one of those like after school specials about it. And then she was like, that's a thing you can do. Oh, okay. And she is the person, I think some of you have heard me mention her before, that she actually ended up in a coma between her sophomore and junior year because she took some diet pills that, hadn't been regulated because supplements don't have to. And, just they didn't go well in her system. So certainly this can be an issue that we want to address. And so clinicians argue that responsible reporting, postvention programs can reduce this effect. And again, that's part of the reason why we're having this event with the psychology department today is, to answer people's questions, to not sweep it under the rug. Okay, so what are the causes? We've already talked about some of them, right? And again, as I articulated on Thursday, none of this is to blame anyone who may have known Colin or may have had someone else in their life die by suicide. This is just an educational component about it. And it's going to go back to the theories we've talked about. So the psychodynamic view argues that suicide is a result of depression and anger at other people that you redirect at yourself. So it's been labeled as murder in the 180th degree. William Stokel argued that no one kills himself who has not wanted to kill another or at least wished the death of another. And Freud himself said, no neurotic harbors thoughts of suicide, which he has not turned back upon himself from murderous impulses against others. Just like side note, we don't know if this is always true. There is some stuff to back it up. I'm going to walk you through this. Again, any of the theories we're going to talk about, some truth, some not truth. So Freud and Abraham, the same student of Freud's who was looking into, I'm just turning off my fan because it's blowing everything everywhere. The same Abraham who was looking into depression, they talked about this being maybe real or symbolic loss of a loved one that leads to introjection of the lost person. And you are unconsciously sort of incorporating that person into your own identity. And in so doing, you internalize the anger you feel towards that person for leaving you. And again, this doesn't have to be an actual death. It can be a breakup, things along those lines. And so that leads to self-hatred. It can lead to depression, and it can lead to death by suicide. So Freud and Abraham saw suicide as the extreme expression of self-hatred. And there is some research to support this. Another thing that's really interesting is this is largely ignored in Freud's theories, but Freud had this idea called thanatos. And yes, this is the same root word as Thanos from the Marvel movies. Freud thought there was a death instinct, just like there was a life instinct of libido. Thanatos was its counterpart. And he said that people will usually redirect this instinct towards other people, but suicidal people turn it in on themselves due to self-anger. And this is supported by the fact that suicide rates typically drop during war. And so you're turning your thanatos on the enemy is the idea. And also societies that have low rates of homicide tend to have higher rates of suicide and vice versa. Again, I sort of call that into question in the US because we have high rates of both, right? But there might be something here in terms of like, where can you direct your emotions, your aggression? The social cultural view comes from Emile Durkheim's theory. And so he talked about egoistic, and this isn't like you have a big ego. The idea here is that you feel alienated from others. Anomic are people who are having disorientation from society. So severe disorientation from society. They just feel like society doesn't fit them, that doesn't understand them, things along those lines. And then altruistic is people who feel taking their own life will somehow benefit society. So these are people like suicide bombers, kamikaze pilots, things along those lines. And when societies go through periods of anomie, so when there's a lot of anomic feelings, everyone's sort of feeling a severe disorientation from society, then we see suicide rates increase. And certainly we could argue the whole world is experiencing this right now because we have to be isolated from one another. In terms of the biological view, genetic theory, again, the idea that there might be something that can be passed down within a family that could be related to suicide. This is likely related to other types of pathology as well, depression, anxiety, what have you. Biochemical theory is that this might be linked to deficiencies in serotonin, and that could lead to suicidal behavior, but also to impulsive or violent behavior. And then again, the nice example, just like our example from earlier in the semester of the schizophrenia and cats thing, right? Low cholesterol is again, one of those things that's kind of out there, right? Is that the idea that maybe excessively low cholesterol increases the risk by maybe affecting serotonin. Again, if you just look at cholesterol in isolation, probably not, but with the interaction with serotonin, maybe, who knows, right? I would imagine there are other things that are linked more closely, like thyroid levels, which we know can, if your thyroid's off, it can give you symptoms like depression, for example. Okay, so age. So unfortunately, there are kids who commit suicide. It's infrequent, but it does happen. We do see in general an increase in self-harm behaviors. So self-harm behaviors, also again, sometimes called parasuicidal behaviors, would be like cutting yourself, burning yourself, things along those lines. This is often preceded by running away from home, being accident prone, aggressive acting out, being really self-critical, socially withdrawn, loneliness, sensitivity to criticism, low frustration tolerance, dark fantasies or dreams. If there's a sudden marked personality change, that can be a red flag in kids. And then obviously if they have an interest in death or suicide, we want to keep an eye on that. Many have been classified as death ignorers because people just assume kids can't understand anything. But in fact, many kids do appear to understand. Again, just in general, we don't give kids enough credit, right? We all know that. Adolescence, so after age 14, unfortunately, rates of suicide increase. There are approximately 2,000 deaths by suicide among adolescents every year, and as many as 500,000 suicide attempts in the US alone. Some people argue that people who are making attempts may be like trying to cry for help or teach others a lesson. I think that we should take it seriously anytime someone is intentionally harming themselves or others, right? So I think that that's an important piece. Depression and hopelessness can come into play here. Also anger and impulsiveness, and just like with adults and adolescents, it does tend to be linked to drug or alcohol issues. Stress, social isolation, and it can be something really short term, or it can be something longer term. The elderly are more likely to commit suicide than any other age group, which often surprises people when I say that. So it's 19 out of every 100,000 folks over 65. And for every 4 attempts, there is a death by suicide. And this has a lot to do with illness, so sort of hastening death, death initiators, loss of control of life, loss of status that we talked about not too long ago, loss of friends and loved ones. The exception is actually elderly among Native Americans and other indigenous peoples, because they are held in high esteem and looked to for wisdom and experience. Unfortunately, under the age of 65, though, Native Americans have the highest rate of death by suicide.
Have they pinpointed a reason?
What's that, Charleston?
Have they pinpointed a reason yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's stuff we talked about last time where, you know, it's their land has been taken away. They don't
Right.
the resources, right? Alcohol was introduced as a means to try to control them, and it's now alcoholism is rampant in reservations and other areas. Yeah, so a lot of these things unfortunately go into play. And again, when people just don't care about you, when so my psych and film class read a book was like perspectives of Native American kiddos. And, you know, if you have been taken away from your home and beaten for speaking your native language, right? We were not great to Native Americans in our history. And neither was Canada, and most places haven't been good to Indigenous peoples. And actually, one of the things that started to happen in more forward-thinking academic communities is when you are speaking, say, at a conference, you acknowledge land rights. So like we here at Wesleyan, because I live right down the street from Wesleyan, we are on the land of the Chesapeake people, who eventually were part of the Powhatan tribe. And so those are important things to know. So here are those suicide rates in the US. You can see there is this peak after adolescence, and then it just really goes up for white men after the age of 65. Again, largely we think due to that loss of status. So what can we do? How can we try to prevent this? What can we do in therapy if someone comes to us? So a lot of the same psychological treatments we studied for mood disorders can come into play here. So cognitive behavioral therapy works very well for depression, but also for suicidal thoughts in particular, right? So you're addressing those thoughts, and are they rational, and are there other ways you could think about things? Dialectical behavioral therapy is a great therapy that was developed specifically for people who are engaging in parasuicidal behaviors, things along those lines. So this is the idea why it's called dialectic, is essentially that both sides of an issue can exist at the same time. So Marsha Linehan, who developed DBT, she has a saying that our clients are trying as hard as they can. That doesn't mean they can't try harder with our help. So the idea is that, you know, teaching them that that black and white isn't true, right? And different things can be true at the same time. In DBT, you do individual therapy, where you work specifically around the self-harm behaviors. So working backwards to find out sort of what was the event that started you on the road to thinking this was the only way you could handle it. And then also there are group sessions. And the group sessions are really more like a class than typical group therapy. And you learn skills that you can do when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling like you might self-harm. So there are mindfulness skills, things like meditation, being in the moment. There are distress tolerance skills. So what can you do when the world around you is just completely overwhelming? And so, you know, if you feel like self-harming and nothing else works, maybe you can hold an ice cube in your hand, right? Because you get an unpleasant sensation, but you're not actually harming yourself. Or maybe there are ways that you can look at the world's beauty in different ways. There are emotion modulation skills. So how do you deal with when your emotions are really overwhelming? And then interpersonal effectiveness skills as well. So how do you explain what's going on with you to the people around you? So I did DBT while I was on my residency. It's very intense. These are the clients I would wake up in the middle of the night worried about. This is not entirely the reason, but this is part of the reason why I decided being a clinician was not for me. Even though I think I was a good therapist, it wasn't good for me to be a therapist. So, but this is very effective. It is long. So most of our treatments, like we were talking about, modern treatments are like 20 sessions or less. DBT, just the first part, is usually 2 years. And that's just because there's so much going on with that person that it takes a lot to help them be safe. IPT that we talked about with depression can work here as well, particularly if interpersonal issues are at the root of what's going on. Antidepressants can help, but again, here you want to make sure you're prescribing things like the SSRIs that the person can't overdose on. If they are experiencing bipolar disorder, lithium or other mood stabilizers can augment the antidepressants. And then again, things like ECT or the other invasive components, right, can be a piece of this. Also, a big part of what people do for folks, especially who struggle with repeated suicidal thoughts or attempts at death by suicide, is step down programs. So there's sometimes just community centers where adults can go and sort of hang out with other people. There are day programs. These are called intensive outpatient treatment, or IOTs. And essentially you go to therapy like it's your job. So you're not in the hospital anymore, you're living in your space, but you go to therapy all day, and that helps you step down from this. Now, in terms of prevention, there are community-based prevention programs like crisis intervention programs that try to help suicidal people see things more accurately in the moment. Suicide hotlines also do this as well. And school-based programs. So you may have at some point had some education around, you know, what is suicide and how do we find it in your school. Although I think this is less common than some other issues. I'm just looking up real quick while I'm talking to y'all a YouTube video I want to show you. Again, there is the Suicide Lifeline, which I've shared several times with y'all. There are more specific ones like the Trevor Project, which is specifically for LGBTQ plus youth. And so there are a lot of sources of help, right? But you have to know about those and you have to feel comfortable seeking help for those to help. So do these work? It can be hard to measure. There are different findings. So sometimes there are no changes once you implement a program. Sometimes it decreases. And sometimes, as we talked about earlier, if it's not done well, it can actually increase thoughts of suicide. Again, that problem is that it might inform people of this possibility that they didn't know existed before. And psychological tests, instruments like the Beck Depression Inventory and the MMPI include items about suicidality. I actually wore my Rorschach dress for y'all today. The Rorschach has components that really get at the deep levels of depression that can be linked to this. So I'm going to show you all a video real quick here. And this is, for those of you who may have been Project Runway fans at some point in your life, this is a video featuring Tim Gunn, who's like one of the people I actually look up to quite a bit. And unfortunately, when he was younger, he attempted to die by suicide. And so he's going to talk about that. So I'm going to share this YouTube page and make sure the sound is on.
Hi, I'm Tim Gunn, and I have a very important message for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, and questioning youth. And that is, it gets better. It really does. And you may be thinking, what does Tim Gunn understand about my anguish, about my despair, about how I'm feeling, about my particular time and place in the world right now? Well, I'll share with you, as a 17-year-old youth who was in quite a bit of despair, I attempted to kill myself. And I'm very happy today that that attempt was unsuccessful. But at the time, it's all that I could contemplate. I thought I need to end things right now. And I have to tell you, when I woke up the next morning after taking more than 100 pills, I was in a whole other level of despair. I thought, I shouldn't be here. This isn't what was meant to be. I frankly just wanted to start life all over again. There are people who can help you. You cannot do this alone. That's another very profound message that I want to give to all of you. It really requires a collaboration between you and the people who love you, the people who you can depend upon, no matter who they are as mentors. In my case, it took a very serious intervention to help me, and it was the result of the botched suicide attempt, to be blunt. I am a huge advocate for the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a suicide prevention hotline for GLBT and questioning youth. And please visit their website, thetrevorproject.org, and seek them out. Your identity will be protected. You don't have to worry about getting parents involved if you're so inclined. I understand the desperation. I understand the despair, and I understand how isolated you can feel. And you have a lot of, get very emotional, people who really care about you, and I'm included in that group. So reach out, get help. You're not alone. It will get better. I promise. Hi.
That's like a second too late there. So again, someone who you think has everything really together, right? That's certainly how he presents. Could certainly have had very different experiences growing up. So that's important to know. And that, you know, now there are these resources that didn't exist when he was 17. So what are some of the warning signs immediately before suicide? Fatigue, sleep loss, or changes in sleep patterns. Again, I just want to say, this is really difficult because these could all also mean something totally different, right? These could mean you have a physical problem going on. Sleep loss, changes in sleep patterns, decline in school performance, social withdrawal, loss of appetite, giving away possessions, writing goodbye letters to friends, So if you know someone who's exhibiting any of these, please get them in touch with the counselors. If it's an immediate situation, please contact security. And then also just know you can do everything right, and that person can still choose to die by suicide. And that is ultimately their choice, and there's nothing you could have done to stop it. One of the things I referenced on Thursday that I'll bring back up now is whether we want to have the right to decide when we die. So when I was growing up in Michigan in the 90s, there was this man called Jack Kevorkian. He was a doctor. And he was actually convicted of second-degree murder for assisting people with suicide who wanted to die. He had actually just a van he would drive around that had morphine and certain other compounds that would help someone pass peacefully. And interestingly, he was in prison for quite some time. And they eventually released him because he has so many health issues that it was, they couldn't care for him. And it was sort of a cruel and unusual punishment aspect there. Oregon and several other states now have what they call a Death with Dignity Act, although Oregon was the first. So in this case, the doctor can choose to prescribe an overdose of medication to help that person pass peacefully. Some of the problems that exist related to this are informed consent. Can someone give knowledgeable consent about a choice to die? And do they understand? Are they being pressured, maybe for economic reasons, or a duty to die? Will this become a medical cost control? Will people feel guilty about burdening their families with medical bills? There's this old movie, I think from the 60s or 70s, called Logan's Run. And in this, it's a, you know, like dystopian sci-fi. And people have just like a light on their hand. And after a certain age, that just goes out. And they tell you like, oh, you move on to someplace better, but they just kill you. So similar in theme actually to The Giver, for anyone who's read that. You know, we certainly don't want people to feel that type of pressure. But we also want people to be able to, you know, make this choice, an informed choice. So actually, it's gonna sound weird. A lot of times psychologists are involved because you have to have a psychological eval to show that you are competent to die, which sounds a little absurd given, you know, how often people die every day. But again, we want to make sure this person's not being coerced into this, that this is their free choice and they're making it when they're of sound mind. Alrighty. So we are going to move on to anxiety disorders now. If anyone has any questions. Oh, I got one in the chat here. Can there be times when the individual doesn't show warning signs? Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah. They can hide it and appear to be fine, but those signs are happening to them on their own. If that makes sense, it makes total sense. I would say, you know, I don't know percentages, but I would say a lot of folks who commit suicide never give any of these signs to anyone around them, even the people they're closest to. So people can be shocked, right? And there are certainly cases where people, you know, did have warning signs, and they just, again, that is that person's choice. But yeah, it can be really common where you just have no idea and it comes out of the blue because, again, when people choose suicide, as much as you are reaching out to them and doing everything you can for them, it's because they feel like this is the only choice they can make and they feel isolated with their own thoughts. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that, you know, I can give you this lecture and try to educate you all I want, but there are going to be cases where there's no warning. And again, my biggest takeaway, I hope for you all out of this is that you don't blame yourselves and that you name it. That you name that this was a death by suicide and that you talk about it that way on campus. And don't let talk about it die, because it's important to acknowledge he was a senior. He was going to graduate, right? And he was a wonderful person that we all really miss. Alrighty, so now I am going to move us into our anxiety disorders PowerPoint. Like I said on Thursday, it's not that anything in this class from this point on is really uplifting, right? But certainly, it gets us a little bit away from a topic that is so on all of our minds right now. So it may feel a little bit of a relief at this point in time. So I'm going to share this and bring out the chat, and then I will stand up by my notes here. There we go. And again, feel free to keep asking questions in the chat at any time. All right, so anxiety disorders. These after mood disorders are the most common disorders that people say. Oh, here's, you can see the Rorschach blot's a little bit better on my dress there. These are really common. And it's also really common to have both an anxiety disorder and a mood disorder. So that's a piece of this as well. So what are the anxiety disorders? Well, there's a difference here between fear and panic and anxiety response patterns. Fear and panic is a really basic emotion. It's one that we've probably always had evolutionarily. Because it keeps us safe. So it involves the action of the sympathetic nervous system and that fight or flight response. It enables us to respond really quickly to dangerous threats, something like a poisonous snake, right? And fear and panic have three components. There is a cognitive or subjective component. So I feel afraid or terrified. Sorry, you guys are seeing way more of my ceiling than of me right now. That's better. I feel afraid or terrified. There's physiological components where you might have your heart rate speed up, be breathing heavily, things along those lines. And there are behavioral components like a strong urge to escape or flee. Anxiety, on the other hand, is a blend of emotions. So fear is just the primary emotion, right? So for those of you who have seen the movie Inside Out, fear is one of them, right? Anxiety is a mix of emotions, and it's a mix of cognitions and thoughts and all kinds of things, and it's future-oriented, and it's more diffuse than fear. So fear is really present-oriented. This is what's happening right now, right? Anxiety is like fear of what could happen. Like fear or panic, there are also cognitive, physiological, and behavioral components to anxiety, but they are subjectively different than those of panic. So the first one is cognitive or subjective. So instead of being afraid or terrified like in panic, you guys are gonna get a little Simba drive-by here. This involves negative mood, worrying about things, about future threats or danger, self-preoccupation. So just like being so concerned that it's hard to look beyond your anxiety. And a sense of not being able to predict the future or control it if it occurs. The physiological component of anxiety is a state of chronic over-arousal, or you're just sort of always on edge, always in readiness for dealing with a threat should it occur. So you're preparing for that fight or flight response. And then the behavioral component is that anxiety may involve the strong tendency to avoid situations where danger may be encountered or that can increase our anxiety itself, to be perfectly honest. Adaptive values of anxiety allow us to prepare for a possible threat. And in mild to moderate degrees, anxiety actually enhances learning performance. And although anxiety is adaptive in those mild to moderate degrees, once it becomes severe, it is very maladaptive. And so this is a graphic representation of what I just said. This is actually called the Yerkes-Dodson law. It has a name in psychology. So this is the idea, is that your anxiety level isn't just, it goes up and your performance goes down. That a little bit of anxiety is actually okay, and that there might be an optimal level of anxiety that's good. So the way that I explain this is, let's say, thinking about our exam next week, you start to think about studying. And you're not worried about the exam at all. Like, I'm like, I'm going to ace this, and you don't study at all. And then you get to the exam and you realize this is 5 chapters worth of material, and maybe I should have taken some time to study, right? Then you would be over here in too little anxiety, right? But if you have too much anxiety and you overstudy to the point that you don't sleep and you're so worried about it, and you get to the exam and you freeze because you just can't remember anything, right? That's also going to lead to a poor performance. So there is some sort of optimal level where you're anxious enough to make yourself study, but not anxious enough for it to get in the way. And that freezing on an exam is actually part of our fear response and anxiety response as well. So it's not just fight or flight, it's also freeze. That is adaptive not only in humans, but animals. So think of a possum playing dead or a deer in headlights, right? These things can actually be adaptive ways of coping with fear in the wild. Random one, but when I was in undergrad, I took a class on animal behavior in the bio department, and we got to watch animals for 20 hours over the course of the semester. And I chose llamas because there was a llama farm, because we were in the middle of rural Ohio. And when llamas get scared, they just lay down. This is how they cope. They just lay down. Interestingly, though, when llamas are not scared and there's a threat, say something much smaller than them, like a fox, they will actually fight. They will trample it to death. So llamas are sometimes being used now to guard sheep instead of dogs, because they can just live with the sheep all the time. All right, so there are several types of anxiety disorder. And we are going to talk about these starting with generalized anxiety disorder, but there are also phobias and panic disorder. These things at the bottom used to be part of the anxiety disorders, and then in the DSM-5, they created their own categories for them. So obsessive compulsive and related disorders, which we'll talk about in this chapter, and then stress-related disorders, which has its own chapter that we'll probably start talking about Thursday as well. So, and why these used to be part of the anxiety disorders section of the DSM is because they do have large components of anxiety in them. But the researchers who worked on the DSM felt that they were distinct enough in other ways to merit their own categories. So generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by excessive anxiety under most circumstances and by worry about practically everything. So if someone came to me and said oh, I've always been a worrier, even when I was a little kid, I was worrying, I would know I need to screen them for GAD. That's a pretty good indication that this might be part of the problem. They are vague, intense concerns and fearfulness. It's sometimes called free-floating anxiety because it just sort of goes to whatever is the thing of the moment. And danger is not a factor here. So danger, and I'm gonna try to set up a video. We'll see if everything behaves today, but I'll talk about it. So it's not like phobias that we'll talk about in a minute here, where there's something really specific you're afraid of, and you're like, oof, because of that, I need to run away. It's just there's always something going on that I need to worry about, and it's not going to kill me. Sorry, I dropped my mouse. But, I just need to worry about it. They feel like everything needs them to spend their time and energy. And that can be obviously a major issue. So let me grab this out here. I wasn't sure how far we get, so I didn't get this ready. But since we're at this point, hopefully we can get this to work. I at least heard the sound word is acknowledging the external drive, so that's good. We'll see if it pulls up. So what I'm hoping to be able to show you, again, we'll see if this cooperates or not, is a clip from a film called Hannah and Her Sisters. It's, oh good, it is gonna work, nice. So let me get it set up while I'm chatting. It is, problematic, and I fully acknowledge that. However, this particular clip is actually a really nice representation of this free-floating anxiety in GAD. So let me get it set up. It's just taking a minute for it to respond to me here. Okay. Pause, unmute. And then do a new share so you all will be able to see it. All right. So you see there at the end that he is happy for just a short amount of time, right? And then he doesn't let himself be happy, or he immediately starts worrying about something else. And that's really the hallmark of generalized anxiety disorder is, you know, like, okay, you can stop worrying about one thing, that's great. And then you find yourself worrying about something else instead. So that can be a big component of this. Okay, so back into the world of GAD here. So what are the symptoms? Excessive worry and anxiety for at least 6 months. And oftentimes, again, much, much longer. So it is apprehensive expectation, and it occurs more days than not for at least 6 months. And it's about a number of events or activities, right? So again, if one thing gets kind of taken care of, you move on to the next worry. And you have to have at least 3 of the following symptoms. So restlessness or feelings of being keyed up or on edge, fatigued, just exhausted, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or feeling like your mind is going blank, irritability with those around you, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. So in particular, it's often difficulty falling asleep, although it can be difficulty staying asleep. You also have significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Now, one thing as you look at this list that might kind of stand out to you is a lot of these symptoms are similar to a mood disorder. And in fact, GAD and depression are so similar that you can't diagnose them simultaneously. You can say, you know, this person has been depressed for the past year, and now they've developed symptoms of GAD, that's fine. But if a person comes into you and seems to have symptoms of both, you've got to choose one, just because they do overlap so much. Worry is the primary feature of GAD. They are always worrying about everything. And worry has a function, otherwise we would never do it, right? Worry is more thoughts than images, so it's words essentially in our mind. And it reduces physiological arousal. So what I mean by this is a lot of times if we allow ourselves to envision things, picture things, we get extra worked up and really upset. And by focusing on those thoughts, on those words, it's sort of a protective feature. We avoid that really negative emotional and maybe physiological experience. When you are worrying, you fail to process the emotional components of those thoughts and images. So a theory here is that if people are suffering from GAD, they might be worrying to lessen their physical and emotional discomfort in the short term. So about 4% of the general population would be diagnosed with GAD. The 12-month prevalence is about 2.9% among adults, and females outnumber males approximately 2 to 1. The onset is insidious. It can begin in early adulthood, but again, oftentimes even from childhood, we sort of see things. And there is a tendency to be anxious that runs in families. So again, suggesting there's probably a genetic component. Or it could also be learned behavior, right? If you've seen your parents worrying about everything all the time, as a kid, you pick up on that. In terms of the sociocultural perspective, GAD is most likely to develop in people faced with social conditions that are truly dangerous, and there's research to support this. So for example, the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown in 1979, after the accident, there were 5 times as many people experiencing anxiety and depression. One of the most powerful forms of social stress is poverty, right? And we know that. People who are in poverty end up having to live in rundown communities that often have higher crime rates. And there are fewer educational and job opportunities. They're also at greater risk for health issues because healthcare access can be difficult. Even when they can access healthcare, a lot of times they're not believed about their symptoms. And they also often live in what are called food deserts. So where the only place to buy groceries within walking distance might be a 7-Eleven. So you can't get good fresh produce. So since race is unfortunately so closely tied to income and job opportunities in the US still, it's also tied to the prevalence of GAD. So there are higher rates of GAD in lower socioeconomic status groups, which we abbreviate SES. And there are also higher rates of GAD among African-American individuals. So in any given year, about 6% of Black individuals suffer from GAD and about 3.1% of white individuals suffer, so almost double. And African-American women have the highest rates, about 6.6%. And again, we know that women in general, but particularly women of color, are even more likely to experience poverty for a whole host of reasons, dealing with sexism and racism and their intersection. There are other factors clearly at work, because even though these rates are higher for people who live in these environments, that's still 94% of people who are not developing GAD, right? So clearly there has to be something else going on. So the psychodynamic perspective, Freud believed that all kids experience anxiety, that this was just a natural part of being. And he talked about different types of anxiety. So realistic anxiety is when you're faced with an actual danger. Neurotic anxiety is when you can't express those id impulses. So, you want to be able to just get whatever you want, and you know that you can't because of society. And moral anxiety occurs when you're punished for expressing those id impulses. So, example here is it's really common for kiddos to just start exploring their bodies, and they may even masturbate, but it's not sexual. They just know oh, touching myself there feels good, right? So if they're punished for that because it's wrong, right, or dirty, that's when they would develop moral anxiety. One can use ego defense mechanisms to control these forms of anxiety, but when they don't work or the anxiety is too high, that's when GAD would develop under this theory. People with GAD are more likely to use defense mechanisms like repression. So repression is sort of a piece of that thinking rather than feeling we just talked about. And children who were severely punished for expressing id impulses do have higher levels of anxiety later in life. Are these results proof of the model's validity? Not necessarily. There are alternative explanations of the data. Discomfort with painful memories or forgetting in therapy isn't necessarily defensive. And some data actually contradict the model. So most people who have GAD report pretty normal childhoods. All right, so what about, there we go, sorry, skipped the therapy slide, very important. So as I mentioned, for the mood disorders, we're going to see the same techniques over and over. So for psychodynamic treatment for these things. So they are going to be having people free associate. They're going to be using therapist interpretation of that free association in conjunction with interpretation of the therapist-client interaction, of dreams, of all of those things. And in terms of specific treatments for GAD, the Freudians focus less on fear and more on trying to control the id. The idea being if your id impulses never get out of control, then you'll be less anxious. Object relations theorists, which are sort of an offshoot of psychodynamic theory that focuses on the relationships between us and the important people in our lives. So for kids, it's the caregivers. For us, it might be our romantic relationships. So they help patients identify and settle early relationship conflicts. And overall, controlled research has not consistently supported psychodynamic approaches and has not shown that it is, in general, helpful for people with GAD. I could certainly imagine how, sort of rehashing your feelings of anxiety would be really problematic for, say, Woody Allen's character in that film clip we just watched, right? But just like with mood disorders, short-term dynamic therapy seems to be beneficial in some cases. So again, these more structured, shorter therapies that use psychodynamic principles in general seem to be helpful for a variety of conditions. So the humanistic perspective. So Rogers did specifically try to explain GAD. So therapists in general, theorists within this perspective in general, say that GAD, like all the other psychological disorders, arises when people stop looking at themselves honestly and acceptingly. And Rogers in particular said that these folks had that lack of unconditional positive regard in childhood. Their parents would, or other people in their lives would sort of imply like, I'll only love you if you get good grades or if you're nice to your siblings. And so that leads to what are called conditions of worth, which are harsh self-standards or feelings that you'll only be loved and accepted if you meet these unrealistic standards you've set for yourself or you feel that other people have set for you. These threatening self-judgments then break through and cause anxiety, and they set the stage for GAD to develop. Therapy here is client-centered, and it focuses on creating an accepting environment where clients experience themselves. Although case reports have been positive, controlled studies have only sometimes found that client-centered therapy is more effective than placebo or not doing therapy at all. And in fact, sort of side note, essentially humanistic therapy ends up being what we use as placebo therapy in a lot of other studies for other treatments. And there's only limited support that's been found for Rogers' explanation of causal factors. So again, client-centered, maybe not the most helpful, long-term psychodynamic, probably not gonna work. Shorter-term dynamic, great. So, I'm going to stop there because I have several slides about the cognitive perspective, and I feel like it will be most helpful to discuss them all together. So let me go ahead and stop share. Alrighty, so I will do my normal sticking around for a couple minutes if anyone does have questions. And if not, I will see you all on Thursday, or I may see some of you in 15 minutes at our event for Colin. So take care of yourselves, engage in a lot of good self-care. We're coming up to when spring break would normally be, so we're going to all start feeling really burned out. So I'm highly recommending that you all make sure you give yourselves time to rest, time to relax. So.